Hey, welcome back to the Bring Our Troops Home podcast. This is episode 2 of The Real Dick Cheney. If you are here for part 2, that tells me that you got something out of part 1. And if you did, I hope you'll check out our website, bringourtroopshome.us, and chip in a few bucks. We are a grassroots veterans organization fighting for a foreign policy that puts America first and returns war powers to Congress the way the Constitution intended. Our work on Defend the Guard is at the center of what we do. This podcast is one of the ways that we tell the truth about how we got here and why we are fighting to change it. Because the men who dragged this country into one disaster after another spent decades polishing their reputation. Washington will call them statesmen. Cable news will call them patriots. Think tanks will call them visionaries. When these dinosaurs finally die, their eulogies will be thick with praise and empty of any honesty whatsoever. If the people who lived through the fallout don't speak up, their legacies will be rewritten before the dirt even settles on their graves. And that's why we're here, to tell the truth before it's buried with them. And Dick Cheney sits at the top of that list, but he didn't operate alone. He wasn't some lone mastermind. He was surrounded by a whole cast of men who shared the same worldview, the same appetite for war, the same contempt for constitutional limits, and in many cases, the same cold ambition. In this episode, we are going to meet them. We are going to talk about those people that Cheney trusted, that he listened to, and who he empowered. And if you've ever wondered how the United States ended up fighting endless wars across the Middle East, you're about to see exactly how the machine was built. Because none of this started on September 11th. It didn't even start in the 1990s. The ideas that shaped the last 20 years came out of the foreign policy establishment long before most Americans were paying attention. They came from inside places like the Council on Foreign Relations, where Cheney himself once sat on the board of directors. They came from Cold War hardliners who learned how to twist intelligence back in the 70s with a group called Team B. And they came from a new generation of ideologues who formed the Project for a New American Century, called PNAC in 1997, and drew up a blueprint for reshaping the world through American military power. Cheney wasn't just a passenger in that world. He was one of the drivers. And when he left the Pentagon in 1993, he didn't retire to the ranch. He walked into Halliburton and built a private empire that made money every single time American troops were deployed overseas. He stayed plugged into every foreign policy circle that mattered, and he surrounded himself with the same men who would later fill the Bush administration. And when he chose himself to be the vice president in 2000, he walked back into government with a ready-made ideological army at his side. So this episode picks up where the last one left off. And now we start pulling back the curtain on the network, the think tanks, the paychecks, the doctrine, and the long march from the Cold War to 9/11. Because to understand what Cheney did after 9/11, you have to understand the world that he built before it. Let's get into it. To understand the Cheney who helped drag America into 2 decades of war, you have to understand the Cheney who came long before that. His worldview didn't show up in the early 2000s, and it wasn't a reaction to 9/11. It wasn't even a product of the Gulf War. The foundations were poured in the 1970s when a young, ambitious Dick Cheney learned how power really works in Washington and who gets to shape the story that leads a country into war. Cheney was the chief of staff for President Gerald Ford when a small group of Cold War hardliners pulled off one of the most dangerous stunts in modern intelligence history. They called themselves Team B. Most Americans had never heard of them, but every catastrophe that came later can be traced back to this moment. And every veteran who later served in Iraq or Afghanistan lived with its consequences. This was the first time a non-governmental group were allowed to bypass career analysts and create their own intelligence just to justify the policies that they already wanted. So here's what happened. A handful of ideological Cold Warriors convinced the White House to let them form an outside panel to review the CIA's assessments of Soviet military power. The CIA wasn't telling the scary story big enough, and these men wanted more. So they built a parallel shop to create a bigger, scarier story. They came in with an agenda. They cherry-picked raw intelligence. They exaggerated the threats, and they presented worst-case speculation as hard fact. Gee, does that sound familiar? The names involved kind of tell you everything you need to know. There was Richard Pipes and Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Pearl and General Daniel Graham and William Von Cleve, and all of them were mastering the skill of bending intelligence to support the outcome they already desired. You're going to hear most of these names again, and the deeper we go, the darker their roles become. Team B claimed that the Soviets had secret weapons programs that the CIA supposedly missed. They claimed that they had doomsday technologies that no one had ever seen. And they had global ambitions that required a much bigger US military, a bigger budget, and a harder posture. But none of it was true. Later reviews found that every major claim from Team B was false. But Team B wasn't trying to be right. It was trying to win on policy. And it did. Team B didn't uncover the truth. It manufactured fear. It turned ideology into analysis. It overwhelmed the CIA with theatrics. It taught Washington a lesson that it never forgot. If the facts don't support your war, you invent new facts. If the intelligence community won't give you the answer you want, you build your own intelligence community. And they did that. Cheney watched this unfold from the inside. He saw how a small group of unelected ideologues could override professionals, rewrite reality, and push a country into more aggressive stance by scaring policymakers into submission. He didn't just absorb this message, he internalized the method. And decades later, the men who sharpened their knives in Team B would be standing right next to him, ready to use the same playbook on Iraq. Now, before we go any deeper into the ideology that shaped Dick Cheney and the network that carried him back into power, I want to pause for a moment and acknowledge someone whose research has done more to expose this world than almost anybody else alive. My friend Scott Horton is the host of Anti-War Radio, the editorial director of antiwar.com, and the author of several incredible books, including the essential book on this topic, Enough Already. Scott is one of the most thorough and fearless foreign policy researchers in America. If you want to understand how Dick Cheney, the neoconservatives, PNAC, AEI, and the entire Team B mentality took over Washington's national security machinery, Scott Horton is the man who mapped that terrain with the clarity and honesty that the establishment has spent decades avoiding. His work's meticulous, his footnotes are devastating, and he's willing to name names that polite Washington pretends not to see. If there's a single book that lays out the rise of the forever war faction, the intellectual lineage, the bureaucratic tricks, the ideological fraud, and the political machinery, it's Enough Already. I'm proud to call Scott a friend, and I'd be dishonest if I didn't say this clearly. Much of what you're going to hear in this episode stands on the foundation and the research that he built. Now, let's get back to our story. After Team B, Cheney didn't step away from the world that shaped him. He stepped deeper into it. And in the late 1980s, while still serving in Congress, he became the director of the Council for Foreign Relations, the CFR. It's the command center of bipartisan foreign policy establishment. And from 1987 to 1989, Cheney sat on the board of the most influential foreign policy institution in the country at the same time that he was overseeing intelligence matters on Capitol Hill and playing a key role in the Iran-Contra investigations that we talked about in episode 1. He wasn't some cowboy outsider trying to hold Washington accountable. He was already deep inside the club. And this was not an accident. This was a reveal. And as Scott Horton writes bluntly in Enough Already, Cheney fit right in because he had always been one of them. He didn't just believe in American global dominance. He believed in using the military and the presidency as tools to enforce it. CFR was a perfect home for somebody with that worldview. The public saw Cheney as a quiet congressman from Wyoming, the no-nonsense Westerner with the calm voice and the hunting vest. But insiders knew something else. They knew he was one of them, a man fully comfortable inside the circles where American foreign policy is shaped long before the American public ever knows it. Cheney himself admitted as much later during a speech to the council. Check it out.
Thank you very much. Well, Les, Pete, I want to thank you all for the warm welcome today. I see a lot of old friends in the room, and it's good to be back at the Council on Foreign Relations. As Pete mentioned, I've been a member for a long time and was actually a director for some period of time. I never mentioned that when I was campaigning for re-election back home in Wyoming, but stood me in good stead.
You see, that last line, that only works if you assume that your audience doesn't know what the CFR is or how much influence it carries. But Cheney knew exactly what he was doing. He was playing the humble Westerner in public while sitting at the center of the foreign policy machine in private. And Horton points out that the CFR is the polite, respectable face of American empire. It's where the assumptions of global primacy, intervention abroad, and a muscular presidency aren't debated. They're taken as gospel. And if you don't join the CFR unless you think America should run the world, and you don't sit on its board unless you plan to help make that happen. To understand the CFR's worldview, it's not complicated. For nearly a century, it has been the headquarters for a bipartisan foreign policy consensus that believes the following: America must lead the world. American military power is a stabilizing force. Global intervention is often necessary. International institutions matter only when they serve U.S. interests. Restraint is dangerous. National sovereignty is negotiable. And a strong executive is essential for foreign policy. Scott Horton is blunt about this. The CFR is the institutional backbone of the Washington foreign policy blob. It's where hawks are groomed, where interventionists are normalized, and where people like Cheney learn how the machinery really works. The CFR has been home to presidents, secretaries of state, CIA directors, generals, central bankers, finance ministers, and corporate titans who shaped the doctrine Cheney would later enforce. Some of the notable members throughout history are Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, National Security Advisor Brzezinski, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, George H.W. Bush, President Bill Clinton, National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, CIA Director and CENTCOM Commander David Petraeus, Secretary of State and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Colin Powell, Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, Treasury Secretary Robert Rubin, and listen to this last one here: international financier George Soros. These are not anti-war thinkers. These are not constitutionalists. Scott calls the CFR, again, the polite salon of the imperial consensus, and he's right. This is not a coalition of doves. This is the foreign policy establishment in its purest form, comfortable with covert operation, regime change, armed diplomacy, and the rules-based order when America writes the rules, or actually more accurately, when people like this write whatever rules they need in the moment to accomplish their own ambitions. To them, America isn't a shining city on the hill or a beacon of truth. It's a tool, a lever, a mechanism to control the world and expand the power and economic dominance of the global elite. Cheney fit in naturally. This was his universe because he already believed the executive branch should dominate national security decision-making. CFR simply gave him a room full of people to nod right along. Notably, there are very, very few former members of the council or close observers of the council who became consistent critics of the council. There are a few, and I think that they're worth mentioning. One is anti-war dissident Noam Chomsky, former member of the council, has condemned CFR for decades as an elite internationalist institution. Military analyst and Pentagon paper whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg, former member, but after he left, he criticized the CFR's influence after leaving government. Army colonel, historian, and non-interventionist Andrew Basovich has challenged the CFR worldview publicly while he was engaged as a member with the institution itself. And then there's my favorite, Dr. Ron Paul, who has repeatedly blasted the CFR as the center of bipartisan interventionist consensus. Now, I have to admit, he was actually never a member of the council. I threw him in there for good measure because true anti-war or non-interventionist CFR members are almost non-existent. The institution selects for certain mindset. Cheney had it, and that's why his time there matters. And this is where Scott Horton's work is so important. He makes it clear that the Cheney we saw after 9/11, the man who treated the Constitution like an inconvenience and viewed the U.S. military as a hammer always looking for nails, didn't suddenly just appear. He wasn't radicalized by events. He wasn't hijacked by the neocons. Cheney's worldview was already built. Team B gave him that method. CFR gave him the pedigree. And the Iran-Contra years while he was in Congress showed him how much you could get away with if you controlled the machinery. The man who would shape American foreign policy after 9/11 was already fully formed long before the towers fell. And this experience set the stage for what comes next. Cheney's exit from government in 1993 and his transformation into the CEO of a company that would profit from every war he later helped sell. When the Soviet Union collapsed, most Americans breathed a sigh of relief. The Cold War was finally over. People talked about a peace dividend. They imagined a smaller military footprint, fewer foreign entanglements, and a country that could finally turn its attention back home. But Dick Cheney didn't see it that way. To him, the fall of the USSR didn't mean America should step back. It meant that America had a once-in-a-century opportunity to push further. If the world now had only one superpower, then that superpower had a responsibility to shape global events. And in Cheney's mind, shaping meant using force. It meant projecting power quickly, decisively, and without any restraint from Congress or the international institutions. This belief carried directly into his role as the Secretary of Defense under President George H.W. Bush. The Gulf War only strengthened his belief. The Gulf War was a lightning-fast campaign, overwhelming superiority, low American casualties, and Cheney walked away convinced that he had seen the future of American warfare. He believed the United States should fight its battles exactly this way, with executive-driven decision-making, overwhelming force, tight messaging, and as little congressional interference as possible. Most Americans saw the Gulf War as a short chapter, but what Dick Cheney saw was a proof of concept. When Dick Cheney walked out of the Pentagon in 1993, he didn't leave as a man winding down a career. He left as someone who believed he had been proven right. The Gulf War had validated everything he thought about how America should use military force, and it especially reinforced his belief that the executive branch should control war-making decisions without any interference from Congress. He also walked away with something else. He now understood just how deeply the private sector lived inside of America's war machine. He had seen how contractors built bases, fed troops, moved fuel, and kept military operations running behind the scenes. He understood the money that flowed through these operations. And he understood the power that came with that money. And he understood how someone like him could use all of it. And by the time he left office in January of 1993, Cheney wasn't questioning whether America should intervene abroad. He was looking for a better way to do it. The Gulf War had shown him that modern warfare ran on logistics, infrastructure, fuel, construction, and supply chains, and he knew exactly which company stood at the center of that world. And that company was Halliburton. And after leaving office, Halliburton recruited Cheney within weeks of him leaving government. He had never run a corporation. He had never held a private sector management job, and he had no hands-on experience in the oil services business, but that didn't matter. Halliburton wasn't looking for an oil man. They wanted a Pentagon man, a foreign policy insider, someone whose Rolodex was worth more than any business degree and whose worldview lined up perfectly with the future that they imagined for their company. Cheney walked into that job as the perfect hire. Now, Halliburton already owned Kellogg Brown and Root, KBR, the sprawling logistics contractor that handled almost every behind-the-scenes job in the U.S. military needed done. KBR built bases, transported fuel, housed troops, moved supplies, ran power grids, installed water lines, operated cafeterias, managed laundry services, and they kept entire forward operating bases alive. And under Cheney's command, that footprint did not hold steady. It exploded. And veterans would later say the same thing. KBR was everywhere. One infantryman from the 1st Armored Division put it this way years later. When we hit Kuwait, the first signs we saw weren't the armies. They were KBR, and you couldn't take a piss in Iraq without passing a KBR logo. They built tents that we slept in. They ran the chow halls. They drove the fuel trucks. They ran the PX where you bought razors. They operated the phones that you used to call home. They even ran the damn laundry. You drop your uniforms off in a giant green bag, and 3 days later, they show up washed, folded, like we were at a damn hotel. They were everywhere. Cheney didn't build that world, but he scaled it. He expanded KBR's reach in every direction, securing more contracts, more locations, more services, and more dependency from the Pentagon. He pushed KBR deeper into the bloodstream of American power projection and turned the company into a logistical backbone of U.S. military operations around the globe. Fast forward a few years into the first decade of the global war on terror, and veterans recalled KBR with kind of a strange mix of gratitude and disdain. They remember the comforts that KBR provided, and they remembered the cost. A National Guard mortar crew joked that the only people with air-conditioned tents were KBR civilians, and the only people who had cold water and hot showers before most Americans did were KBR civilians. A Marine in Fallujah remembered chow halls run like a 5-star restaurant with ice cream bars and Mongolian grills and God knows what the taxpayers were billed for it. A guardsman from Idaho recalled running more missions escorting KBR fuel truck convoys than fighting insurgents. He said, "We were risking our lives to protect a corporation's delivery schedule. That's when it hit me. We were fighting for Halliburton as much as we were fighting for the flag." Now, a rifleman who was in Missoula summed up his comments bitterly. He said, "We were sleeping in shell craters while KBR had a Burger King up and running within a month." Others noticed that KBR lost more fuel in a week than their units used in a month. One veteran said plainly, "The war didn't feel like it was meant to end. For them, it was too damn profitable." These aren't isolated experiences. Ask any veteran that served. They were the common language of two wars. KBR didn't just support the U.S. military. In many ways, the U.S. military supported KBR. Dick Cheney understood this world better than almost anyone, and he knew which generals needed what. He knew which programs the Pentagon would fund. He knew how much to write proposals that would get approved. His experience wasn't in oil, it was in influence. And he used that influence to transform Halliburton into a company built to thrive in a world of constant American intervention. Under his leadership, Halliburton's revenue from government contracts skyrocketed. Its dependence on military deployments deepened, and Cheney personally became wealthy through stock options, bonuses, and deferred compensation tied to Halliburton's future success. Same man who believed America should wield force frequently and without restraint was now financially tied to a company that made money every time America deployed troops. And that wasn't a coincidence. Folks, that was by design. While Cheney was building Halliburton into a war services empire, he never stepped out of Washington's foreign policy ecosystem. He gave speeches at the American Enterprise Institute and the Council on Foreign Relations. He showed up at defense symposiums. He stayed plugged into the network of men who had shaped his worldview back in the Team B and Cold War days. He met with and consulted with Wolfowitz, Pearl, John Bolton, Elliot Abrams, Zalmay Khalilzad, Robert Kagan, Bill Kristol. Now, we've heard those names before already, and they're going to come up again. I'm going to keep pointing them out. As Horton puts it in enough already, this wasn't some casual old boys circuit. AEI and PNAC were the main staging grounds for the same Team B crowd that had been agitating for more aggressive American power since the 1970s. Cheney wasn't wandering in as a guest speaker. He was circulating amongst his own faction. This wasn't a nostalgia tour. It wasn't grooming. Cheney was positioning himself as the elder statesman of a movement that believed that America should reshape the world through military power. He didn't have the academic gloss of Wolfowitz or the theatrical flair of Pearl, but he had something that they didn't. Experience running the Pentagon, decades of connections, and now CEO and chair of a company built to profit from the very worldview these men championed. Horton's point is that these weren't separate worlds, the think tanks, the corporations, the Pentagon, the congressional hawks. It was all part of the same ecosystem, one network, the foreign policy blob. The same faces rotating through the same institutions, all preaching variations of the same doctrine that American hegemony enforced at gunpoint. And as the 90s rolled on, the Soviet Union was gone, the world was in transition, and the neoconservative movement was looking for its next target, its next cause, its next chance to prove that American hegemony was not only good, but it was necessary. And Cheney was in position to help them find it. And by the mid-1990s, with the Cold War over, the foreign policy establishment searching for its next mission, a familiar group of hawks began regrouping. They weren't interested in the peace dividend at all. They weren't celebrating a safer world. They saw the collapse of the Soviet Union as an opening, a vacuum, a moment for America to become what they believed it was always meant to be, the dominant superpower, shaping global events by force. And in 1997, those men, that group, they formalized their vision by launching the Project for a New American Century, better known as PNAC. If the Council on Foreign Relations is the polite establishment and AEI is the neocon war factory, then PNAC was the manifesto, the mission statement, the written blueprint, a pamphlet for American global hegemony dressed up as academic analysis. Scott Horton called PNAC the Team B crowd resurrected. And he's right. The same men who had exaggerated Soviet threats in the 1970s were now recycling those same techniques to claim that America needed to confront new enemies in the Middle East. And PNAC wasn't subtle about it. They argued openly that the United States should maintain overwhelming military superiority, expand its global presence, and be willing to overthrow governments that challenged U.S. interest. Diplomacy was fine as long as it didn't get in the way of force. And at the center of their worldview was one target above all others: Iraq. The founders of PNAC were not new faces. They were the same men who had cut their teeth in Team B and spent the 90s sharpening their arguments inside American Enterprise Institute. And this wasn't just a think tank. This was a war council waiting, scripting, planning for the next war. Horton wrote in that PNAC functioned as a war council waiting for a war. I would argue that they were a war council preparing, creating, manifesting their own war. Their letters, their white papers, their memos, and the op-eds all pointed towards the same conclusion: that the U.S. needed to remove Saddam Hussein by force. And in 1998, PNAC sent a public letter to President Bill Clinton demanding that he remove Saddam Hussein by force. They warned of threats that actually didn't exist. They overstated dangers that they couldn't prove, and they insisted America's global credibility depended on military action now. Does that sound familiar? It was the B team. Team B in a new suit. Cherry-picking raw intelligence, exaggerating worst-case scenarios, and presenting speculation as gospel. Cheney wasn't a signatory on any of those letters, though. But he didn't need to be. Cheney never publicly joins anything that he can influence silently from the shadows. And this is where Horton's work and his insight cuts right through the mythology. He pointed out that Cheney actually never signs his name to public manifestos. He prefers to work behind the scenes where the real levers of power sit. Signing PNAC's letters would have drawn attention to him. More importantly, he was the CEO of Halliburton at the time. Putting his name on a letter calling for war his own company would profit from would have been too obvious, even for Dick Cheney. He didn't need the attention. He didn't want the smoke, and he certainly didn't need the heat. He needed plausible deniability. He needed the movement to speak for him, and they did. This is Dick Cheney's defining trait: power without visibility, influence without fingerprints. During PNAC's most active letter writing years from 97 to 98, Cheney was the CEO, publicly traded company, multinational corporation. And that meant two things. He had to appear above politics to protect Halliburton's business and its shareholders. And he could not publicly endorse a document calling for a new war in Iraq without raising suspicions that he might profit from it. Signing a call for regime change in Iraq would have essentially announced that I am the CEO of a major defense-linked corporation and I want war that my company will benefit from. He wouldn't do it. He's not that dumb. Even Cheney is not that reckless. But if you look, it's there. He did it. But he needed plausible deniability, and he kept it. He never put his name on one of those letters. Besides, PNAC was filled with his closest ideological allies: Wolfowitz, Pearl, Crystal, Kagan, Abrams, Bolton, Khalilzad, Wormser. There's all those names again. These were his people. They signed the letters. They took the heat. They built the public case. Cheney didn't need his name on it because the movement already spoke for him. Looking forward for just a minute, when Bush won in 2000, Cheney hired all of those same PNAC signatories and put them all in positions of power. All of them. So why sign the manifesto when you can just hire the authors? By the late 1990s, Cheney was already quietly advising the Republican donor class and the national security establishment that he saw an opening with a young governor from Texas named George W. Bush, long before most people realized that Bush would be the nominee. If Cheney signed PNAC's hyper-aggressive letters, he risked looking too radical, looking too eager for war, scaring moderates, and making himself unpalatable as a future vice president or power broker. Cheney's goal wasn't to be a cheerleader for PNAC. His goal was to be the man who would execute PNAC's agenda once he got back inside the White House. Cheney didn't sign because he didn't need the credit, but he wanted the control. And PNAC letters were a megaphone. And Cheney didn't care about megaphones. He cared about machinery. PNAC built the doctrine, Cheney built the infrastructure. Halliburton, KBR, Pentagon ties, CFR credentials, AEI ties, Team B alumni, neocon networks. And when the time came, Cheney had the ideology, the team, the bureaucracy, the war profit pipeline, the vice presidency, and anybody with an ounce of intellectual honesty, he had the presidency too. He didn't need his name on the letters. He needed the worldview behind them. And he carried that into power in January of 2001. See, the simple truth is that Cheney wasn't a signatory because signing letters is for ideologues. Cheney's an operator. Operators don't sign, they execute. And that's the part most Americans never actually grasped. PNAC was drafting policy papers while Cheney was building the machine that would execute them. KBR was expanding its footprint. Halliburton was securing contracts. Cheney was cementing connections across the foreign policy elite. PNAC drew the blueprint. Cheney constructed the supply lines. They weren't separate movements. They were parallel tracks headed towards the same destination. And by the end of the 90s, it was clear that what PNAC wanted. It wanted regime change in Iraq. It wanted American dominance across the Middle East. It wanted presidents who trusted his worldview. It wanted a national security team made up of its signatories. It wanted a crisis big enough to justify its ambitions. And it wanted somebody inside the White House who could put their plan into motion. What they lacked was a crisis big enough to force their agenda through a political system. Cheney knew it. PNAC knew it. Scott Horton knew it too. He writes that PNAC's authors understood their grand plan would be slow and politically impossible absent a catalyzing emergency. Their doctrine was ready. Cheney's machine was ready. All that remained was assembling the team, slipping into the next administration, and waiting for the moment that would open the door. Now, by the late 1990s, the Republican primary field was crowded. John McCain, Elizabeth Dole, Alan Keyes, several others had deeper resumes, sharper intellects, and far more seasoning on the national and international stage. None of them needed a heavyweight foreign policy partner to make them credible. But George W. Bush did. Bush was the Texan governor with no foreign policy experience and no demonstrated interest in global affairs. Inside the Beltway, analysts and insiders whispered openly about his lack of gravitas. And one headline at the time captured the mood perfectly. It said, "Still too dumb to be president?" Critics warned Bush lacked the analytical curiosity and depth to navigate national security crises. To many, he looked outmatched before the race had even begun. But Bush's weakness, the very thing that made him look unqualified, had a hidden upside for the people circling Washington's foreign policy establishment. His inexperience meant that he didn't have his own doctrine. He had no foreign policy faction. He had no worldview, no team of loyal national security advisors, nothing to get in the way. In other words, he was a blank slate, an empty suit, a silhouette waiting to be filled in. And the neocons knew exactly how to fill that blank space. Before we go any further, I think it's worth taking a moment to acknowledge something that's really uncomfortable for me. As bad as George W. Bush was as a leader, a thinker, and a wartime president, the alternative in 2000 could have been even worse. If John McCain, the neoconservative movement's first choice, had won the nomination and chosen Cheney as his vice president, America First people like me would still be waking up today in cold sweats. McCain never met a bombing campaign that he didn't want to expand. Pair that with that appetite with Cheney's cold, surgical mindset. And I don't think even Hollywood could dream up the foreign policy nightmare that alliance would have produced. So from a twisted silver lining perspective, Bush might have been the better of the two bad options. The womanizing, hard-drinking, rich kid raised in the shadow of a CIA father, the guy who coasted through life with every advantage money and connections could buy. Bush wasn't qualified. He wasn't even thoughtful. And he certainly wasn't ready for what was coming. But compared to a McCain-Cheney ticket, Bush was tolerable. And that's exactly what made him useful. Bush came with none of the baggage, no national security ideology. He didn't have a foreign policy team or a philosophy. He had nothing. He was an empty void. And Dick Cheney saw that. He saw it before anybody else. He saw it, and then he brought and awoke the neoconservative movement to it. So now they saw it. So when Bush needed someone to help him choose a running mate, Dick Cheney stepped forward. He volunteered to run the search, and on paper, it looked like the act of an elder statesman, a steady hand guiding a young conservative towards wise decisions. But Cheney wasn't evaluating candidates. He was evaluating the landscape. He ran the process. He sifted through the names. He measured the field. And after interviewing all others, he delivered his final recommendation. The most qualified, most experienced, most indispensable running mate for George W. Bush was himself, Dick Cheney. That's right. He recommended himself after leading the search. Insiders didn't even blink. They knew exactly what had just happened. Bush got his running mate. Bush got his gravitas. Cheney got a presidential puppet. And the men waiting in the wings finally got their chance when George W. Bush won the presidency in 2000, because Cheney didn't walk into the West Wing as the vice president alone. He walked in with a network. The most aggressive foreign policy faction in modern American history, a cadre of ideologues who had spent decades pushing their theories, writing their papers, and waiting for the moment when they could put it all into practice. Now, we've mentioned them before. Their names make the hair on the back of my neck stand up. But now it's time to actually meet them. Think of them like the deck of cards from the Iraq War. Only these men are on our side of the ocean. We shouldn't view them as enemies. Or should we? Paul Wolfowitz, the intellectual engine of the Iraq War, had been pushing for regime change since 1991. Famously, he insisted that we'd be greeted as liberators. Scott Horton calls him the movement's theorist in chief and the most dangerous idealist. Douglas Faith, head of the Office of Special Plans. This is a shadow intelligence shop that invented the Saddam Al-Qaeda connection out of thin air. Does that sound familiar? Team B, reflect back to earlier in the episode. General Tommy Franks famously called him the effing stupidest guy on the face of the earth. Horton goes further and calls Faith the architect of the worst intelligence failures since Vietnam. David Wormser, author of A Clean Break. Now, if you don't know what a clean break is, you need to read this memo. It was written for Benjamin Netanyahu's government. It called for the extermination of Iraq and the removal of Saddam Hussein. And he later became Cheney's personal Middle East advisor. He is one of the earliest and purest neocon ideologues. Elliot Abrams, convicted in the Iran-Contra, pardoned and brought right back into government. He's a lifelong evangelist for intervention. He's described as a career-long apologist for covert wars. Next, John Bolton, openly hostile to diplomacy. He once said losing 10 floors of the United Nations wouldn't make a bit of difference. Horton calls him the neocon ID stripped of all pretense. Pretty fair. Next, Scooter Libby, Cheney's hammer. He helped shape Colin Powell's UN testimony. He took the fall for obstructing in an investigation and Cheney's bridge between the ideologues and the bureaucracy. Scooter Libby is one of those good soldiers. Richard Pearl, the Prince of Darkness, a Hawk's hawk who pushed for confrontations with Iraq, Iran, and Syria. He's the spiritual leader of the neoconservative movement. Robert Kagan, co-founder of PNAC. He preached benevolent global hegemony, with benevolent doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Okay. Horton paints him as the movement's chief salesman of the empire. Bill Kristol, the movement's megaphone. He used the Weekly Standard to cheerlead every intervention of the era. He's known as the press agent for the war party. Zalmay Khalilzad, PNAC's signatory. This is the guy that signed the letters. Later, he was an ambassador to Afghanistan and Iraq, shaping both occupations. He was the connective tissue between PNAC theory and U.S. military operations. Now, former CIA Director James Woolsey. He claimed that Iraq was behind 9/11 within hours of the attack, without any evidence. Scott Horton describes him as the perennial alarmist who never met a conspiracy he didn't elevate. Now, these men, they weren't advisors. They weren't acquaintances. They weren't Tea Party friends. They were Cheney's faction. These were his people. And once Cheney positioned himself as the vice president, these men flooded into the national security apparatus, the Pentagon, the State Department, the intelligence agencies, the policy offices, the task force. It wasn't a transition. It was an installation. And from that moment on, the Team B worldview fused with PNAC's blueprint, powered by Halliburton's logistical empire, backed by the CFR pedigree and sharpened by AEI's ideological edge. And this entire rotten stew of world domination and constitutional bypassing shattered the conservative Republican Party, destabilized the U.S. system of checks and balances. It gutted the American privacy and civil liberties, and it dragged our republic away from its claim as a beacon to the world. They had everything they needed. All that was missing was a crisis big enough to open the door. And somewhere in their own writings, these same men had already said that transforming America's role in the world would be slow, absent a catastrophic and catalyzing event. We're going to come back to that statement shortly, because that crisis that they were hoping for arrived on the morning of September 11th, 2001. Nobody who lived through that morning forgets where they were. A clear blue sky over Manhattan, morning commutes, kids walking into school, coffee cups cooling on the kitchen counters. Then at 8:46 a.m., the world snapped. And inside the White House, the first reports were quite confusing. A plane had hit the World Trade Center, maybe a small one, maybe it was an accident. But minutes later, when the second plane hit, the room changed. The questions stopped, and everybody knew exactly what this was. And Cheney was rushed to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the PEOC. It's the bunker under the White House. Agents grabbed him by the belt and physically hauled him down the stairs. And once he was inside, the Navy captain running the room turned to Cheney for direction, not because the Constitution said so, but because President Bush was thousands of feet above the ground, unreachable, flying blind in hostile skies with no idea whether he was the next target. For a brief but critical window, America didn't have a functioning constitutional chain of command. It had a vacuum, and power abhors a vacuum. Inside the bunker, emotions were raw. Reports came that another plane was headed for Washington. Others said car bombs were being found downtown. Every rumor felt like truth, and the smoke from the Pentagon bled into the air, and nobody knew how many attacks were coming or how long the assault would last. But here's what mattered. While the rest of the country was frozen in shock, the men who had spent decades building doctrine that required a catalyzing event suddenly understood what they were looking at. This was the moment that their entire worldview had been waiting for. And Cheney was now the man in the seat. In the year 2000, the Project for a New American Century released a document titled Rebuilding America's Defenses. It wasn't a dry planning paper. It was a manifesto. It was a blueprint for a world where the United States would dominate every region on earth, deter every rival, and reshape whole governments if necessary. Its themes were clear, but they were blunt: that America must maintain overwhelming, unmatched military superiority. That was first and foremost. That the United States should permanently station forces around the world. That the Pentagon must be able to fight and decisively win multiple simultaneous major theater wars. New technologies, new bases, new doctrines, and new enemies. We needed new enemies. And if democracy got in the way, so be it. American power came first. But buried deep inside all of that, in that same document, was a sentence that would haunt the next several decades. The sentence said, "The process of transformation is likely to be a long one, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event like a new Pearl Harbor." That was in the year 2000, folks, and most Americans had never heard that line. But the men who wrote it were the same men now running the U.S. foreign policy: Wolfowitz, Faith, Khalilzad, Pearl, Crystal, Kagan, Bolton, Abrams. It was practically the PNAC masthead, lifted straight from the think tank journal and placed inside the federal government. Scott Horton has stressed that for years that the PNAC authors weren't predicting 9/11. They were confessing a political reality. Their agenda was too extreme, too expensive, too reckless to survive a normal democratic debate and progression. It needed a shock, something that would silence any objections, something that would terrify Congress into obedience and make the public accept things that they never would have accepted on a calm day. Something catastrophic, something catalyzing, something like a new Pearl Harbor. And on the morning of September 11th, that barrier collapsed in moments. This is not about a conspiracy. This is not about Cheney and PNAC. They didn't bring the planes. but they did understand what the attack meant for the project. The shock, the fear, the confusion, the unity. Suddenly, all the political friction that they had faced for a decade was gone. That one sentence from Rebuilding America's Defenses, absent some catastrophic and catalyzing event, stopped being hypothetical. It became the political key they had always known that they lacked. 9/11 didn't create their doctrine, it activated it. It turned a theory into a timetable. It turned a wish into a roadmap. It turned a fringe strategy into a national policy. And while firefighters dug through the rubble and families waited for news, the policy class that Cheney led saw something else. A door swinging wide open that they had been pounding on for a decade. A door that they never expected to open this wide, this fast, or with this much force. Bush was emotionally shaken, physically isolated, and repeatedly moved to different Air Force bases because nobody knew how secure the skies were. And in that confusion, Dick Cheney took over. Inside the bunker, he gave shoot-down orders for civilian aircraft, which is a presidential authority. And he did it before the military had clear confirmation that Bush had delegated that authority. But later, Bush aides scrambled to revise the timeline to make it look like the president had been looped in. He wasn't. But the contemporaneous notes, they're pretty clear. Cheney acted first and the bureaucracy followed. This was the moment the unitary executive theory stopped being an academic argument and became a real operational doctrine. David Addington, Cheney's legal bulldog, was at his side the entire time. He began drafting emergency authorities, expanding executive power, and dusting off every legal argument they need to run the government from the vice president's wing. Within a day, Addington was drafting the memos that would become the legal foundation for everything from warrantless surveillance to extraordinary rendition. Congress wasn't consulted. It wasn't even part of the conversation. And commentators later call this period the Cheney Regency. Horton goes further. He argues that Cheney finally had what he always sought: a presidency unrestrained by law, oversight, or constitutional limits. And for a few hours, he effectively was the United States government. And he governed like a man with a mission. While the fires were still burning, the next machine roared to life, the intelligence apparatus. And it followed the same patterns that Cheney had learned during Team B. Douglas Faith created the Office of Special Plans, a parallel intelligence shop designed explicitly to bypass the CIA and feed the White House threat assessments the analysts would never support. Horton has spent years documenting how OSP reverse engineered intelligence to fit a predetermined conclusion that Saddam Hussein was behind 9/11, or at least behind Al-Qaeda in some way that justified war. Cheney personally visited CIA headquarters more than any vice president in history, sometimes sitting in rooms with analysts whose job were to tell him what he didn't want to hear. The pressure was enormous. Intelligence officers later described it as an effort to drag them towards conclusions. Every path was bent towards Iraq. Every doubt was treated as disloyalty. Every wild claim was treated as a possible truth. Cheney wanted the dots connected, and they were connected. But whether the dots actually existed or not is another argument. The groundwork for Colin Powell's UN speech began right here in the weeks after 9/11, as the administration quietly massaged new intelligence into talking points. This was not analysis. This was manufactured messaging. It was intentionally deceptive to the American people. The American intelligence machine prepared the raw materials. The media machine delivered them to the public. Leaks poured into the New York Times, most of them routed through Judith Miller, who printed the administration's claims with credibility of the nation's most prestigious newspaper. Bill Kristol, remember him? Bill Kristol's Weekly Standard amplified every rumor. Fox News pumped out every unvetted claim with anonymous intelligence officials. And every night, Americans heard the same message that Saddam was linked to Al-Qaeda, that Saddam was seeking uranium, that Saddam was building WMDs, that Saddam was a nuclear threat. Put yourself in 2025. Do those arguments sound familiar? You can trace many of these claims back to Faith's Office of Special Plans. The stories weren't just wrong, they were engineered, they were fake, they were completely made up. But Bush played the public role. He was the steady wartime president. Cheney played the architect, the man who whispered the lines. But then came the line from Condoleezza Rice, delivered with clinical precision, and it changed public perception instantly. She said this, check it out.
There will always be some uncertainty about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
It didn't matter that Iraq had no nuclear program. Fear had done his work. Fear always does its work. In the weeks after 9/11, America had a black eye and a broken heart. The country demanded a response. Cheney and his circle of hardened ideologues wanted Iraq, but politically, they had to settle for Afghanistan first. Oh, shucks. Congress now faced the most serious choice that our republic ever puts before elected officials. The Constitution is clear. Only Congress may change the condition of our nation from peace to war. Their duty was to decide, declare war or don't. But instead, they took a third option. They punted. Rather than debate the cost, the goals, or the strategy, rather than follow the process the founders designed, Congress handed the president a blank check, and standing right there to collect it and hold it for safekeeping was Dick Cheney. They didn't declare war. They passed an authorization of use of military force, an AUMF, with just one dissenting vote. Barbara Lee stood alone and warned that Congress was giving the president a permission slip for a forever war. And she was right. Now, I want to read the key passage because this is the moment the Constitution track snapped. The president is authorized to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks that occurred on September 11, 2001, or harbored such organizations or persons in order to prevent any future acts of international terrorism against the United States. That language didn't just open a door. It blew the freaking hinges off. Senator Rand Paul, years later, broke it down in plain English. He said the AUMF gave the president authority to do four things: to kill or capture anybody who planned or aided in the attacks, to kill or capture anybody who executed the attacks, to kill or capture Osama bin Laden, and to destroy the terror training camps. Now, if Congress had written exactly that, we might be having a different conversation today, but they didn't. They wrote something so broad, so vague, so open-ended that it allowed the president to use military force against any nation, any organization, any person, anywhere on earth for any length of time, as long as he could claim some connection to 9/11. And Congress signed it. This wasn't caution. This wasn't prudence. This was a complete abdication of responsibility. Cheney's legal enforcer, David Addington, remember him? He helped craft it. He wrote it this way on purpose. He knew exactly what he was doing. The 2001 AUMF became the most dangerous delegation of war power in modern American history. It turned the president into a global hunter, unbound by time limits, geographic limits, oversight, or even a clearly defined enemy. This was the constitutional hinge. This was the break. This was the moment the Republic stepped off the track. It was an about face from Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the very heart of how we're supposed to go to war. And once Congress surrendered, Cheney's unitary executive theory took hold. And from that moment on, the executive branch wasn't co-equal in matters of war. It was dominant. And the people, through their representatives, were cut out of the most solemn decision a nation can make. This is exactly why Bring Our Troops Home and the Defend the Guard movement exist. Congress didn't just refuse to declare war in 2001. They did it again in 2003 with Iraq. And because of that, our National Guard, our home defense force, has been used as an expeditionary invasion force and an occupying force around the globe for more than 20 years. If Congress refuses to do its duty, then the states have to interpose. State legislatures must refuse to allow our citizen soldiers to be scooped up into federal authority at the whim of a single individual called the president. It really is that simple. By the end of 2001, the pieces were already in motion. Afghanistan was already underway, but inside the administration, attention was shifting somewhere else. The same men who had spent the 1990s writing about Iraq had finally found their crisis and were now holding the levers of American power, and they hadn't forgotten their real target. The intelligence machine was already bending towards Baghdad, and Cheney was asking for updates that had nothing to do with Afghanistan. Wolfowitz and Faith were pushing briefings that treated Iraq as the central front of terrorism, even though the evidence never supported it. The Office of Special Plans quietly funneled raw, unvetted claims to the White House. Scott Horton has said for years that by late 2001, the war in Iraq wasn't a question of if, it was a matter of timing. Every day, more dots were being connected publicly, and every night, more intelligence was being shaped privately, and every week, more officials were nudged into the same conclusion. The media joined in. Stories about aluminum tubes and Niger uranium started trickling out. Anonymous intelligence resources warned Washington of an apocalyptic scenario. Editorial boards began framing Iraq as unfinished business, and the White House messaging machine did exactly what it was designed to do. It took every rumor, every half-truth, every fear, and fed it right back to the American people. Meanwhile, Congress had already disarmed itself. They'd been castrated. By refusing to declare war and passing the AUMF instead, they created a president who didn't need their permission to expand the battlefield. Cheney understood that better than anyone. The authority was loose, it was vague, it was elastic. If he could connect Iraq to 9/11, even by insinuation, the legal groundwork was already laid. And this is where the door to Iraq truly opened. Afghanistan became a stepping stone. The AUMF became the legal shield. The intelligence machine became the delivery system. The media became the megaphone, and the fear became the fuel. And by early 2002, the administration was speaking in one voice: Iraq is next. It didn't matter that the intelligence community still couldn't find evidence linking Saddam Hussein to al-Qaeda. It didn't matter that inspectors were returning to Iraq. It didn't matter that none of the claims about nuclear weapons held up. The decision was already made. The policy was already locked in. The United States stood at the edge of war built on lies. A war drafted in the think tanks. A war reverse engineered through intelligence or fake intelligence. A war sold through fear. A war that never needed to happen. So as we close this episode, we stand at the threshold of the moment when Cheney and his war council finally get what they had been waiting for since early 1990. The full power of the American military aimed at Iraq. Episode 3 will pick up right here, the road to Baghdad, and walk step by step through how they pushed this country over the edge. Now, if you've made it this far into our series, The Real Dick Cheney, thank you. These are not easy chapters to revisit, but if we don't tell the truth about how our country was dragged into 2 decades of war, nobody will. And the people who built this machine are counting on our silence. If you want to help us fight back, I hope you'll take a minute and visit bringourtroopshome.us and chip in a few bucks. We are a small veteran-led organization taking on the most powerful political forces in America, and every donation, $5, $10, whatever you can spare, keeps the mission alive and growing. And if this episode resonated with you, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a rating, share it. The simple act helps reach more people, build more momentum, and push harder for real limits on war powers, starting with Defend the Guard in state legislatures across the country. Also, take a minute and visit defendtheguard.us and sign our petition and proudly put your name behind the truth that our country should not go to war until Congress votes to declare it. The more people understand how we got here, the more momentum we have to change the future, starting with returning war powers to Congress and passing Defend the Guard across the country. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for standing with us. I'll see you on episode 3, The Road to Baghdad.